Two masked figures are dancing in the sunlight, like sequined dragonflies. The clown is in love with the ballerina. He blows her a kiss. She doesn't see him, but pirouettes as if in a dream. Now the clown holds up his hands and a rose blossoms from his fingers. He offers it to the ballerina, who takes it, then dances on. The clown is disconsolate, dejected. The ballerina dances on in a world of her own. At the end of the week, Peachem's circus was folding. Belle and Charlie's world was coming to an end. The circus had gone bust, unable even to stagger on until the end of the season. Moodily, Charlie kicked a pebble in the lay-by. The only trouble was the lay-by was empty. The road was empty. The whole world was empty except for a couple of birds in the sky, and they had no money. "I wish," Charlie began when Belle interrupted. "Car coming. You ready?" "Yes." He pulled the white mask down over his face, and they stood, poised, waiting. Mr. Barker and his family were on holiday. The same family holiday they had every year. The same 6 days' rain, the same one fine day. The same shingle, the same cold grey sea, the annual tragedy of the dropped ice cream. "Don't you sometimes wish," Mr. Barker said to his wife, "that you could turn a corner and see something utterly different?" "How do you mean, dear?" "Oh, I don't know. Surprise me, fate," he thought. "Look, Daddy! Oh, look, Daddy, look!" Some way ahead, two glittering figures had stepped into the road. "What are they doing, Daddy? What are they doing?" They were like hummingbirds in their brilliant sequined costumes, wheeling and dipping beneath the blue sky. Mr. Barker drove slowly towards them, staring. The clown was now running towards them, inviting them into the lay-by, while the ballerina danced on alone in her golden mask. "He wants us to stop, Daddy. Please, Daddy, can we, Dad?" Behind the clown's white mask, two shrewd eyes assessed the family as they got out. Two little girls, flushed and excited. A boy of about 10, fancying himself too old for enjoyment. The mother not so good. The father. Hey, there's a fine, smiling gentleman, good for £1 at the very least. The clown and the ballerina joined hands, bowed, and began their act. Their act was simple enough. The clown was in love with the ballerina, but she didn't appear to see him, and danced as if in a dream, serious and self-absorbed. The ballerina had danced away, leaving the clown disconsolate. He turned his back on her, and coming forward offered a paper rose to the smallest girl. She shrank from him and hid in her mother's skirts. "She's shy," Mrs. Barker said. "I want one too," said the second little girl. At any moment she'd wail that it wasn't fair. Life isn't fair, Charlie could have told her. Still, he brought his hand out from behind his back, flicked his fingers, and there was another rose. "It was splendid," said Mr. Barker. "I enjoyed it." Now Belle came up beside him, all gold and yellow and shining. The smallest girl, fascinated, toddled up on her fat legs. "Pretty," she said, and put her hand out to touch the golden mask. Belle jerked her head away sharply, but the child's fingers had caught in the elastic and it snapped. The mask fell off. The child stared, burst into tears, and ran back to her mother. "What's that on her face?" whispered the other girl, too audibly. "It's a scar, silly," said the boy. "What did you think it was, a worm?" The clown sprang on him, knocked him to the ground, and began punching him hard. Mr. Barker caught hold of Charlie's arm and pulled him roughly to his feet. There was the sound of ripping cloth. Immediately, Mr. Barker felt his back being pummeled by furious fists. "You're tearing it! He's got to wear that tonight!" Looking round, he saw that she'd hidden her scarred face behind curtains of hair. Oh, poor girl, he thought with a pang. Then he felt a sharper pain as Charlie bit his hand. He yelped and let go of the boy's arm. "Scarper!" shouted Charlie, and ran. Belle seemed in no hurry. "He bit me," Mr. Barker was saying. "Look, it's bleeding." "That's nothing," said Belle. "You won't die. Cleaned his teeth this morning." "Glad to hear it," said Mr. Barker. "You're from that circus, aren't you?" said Mrs. Barker. "I've a good mind to complain. I wonder what they'll say when they hear how you've behaved." "Me?" said Belle. "I've done nothing. I've been insulted, I have. My dear, I'm sure Donald never meant—" "He's got no call to mention worms," shouted Belle, her voice thick with tears. Mr. Barker stared at the tear tracks on her cheek. Did Charlie take his hat? She asked. I'm afraid I didn't notice. It doesn't seem to be here. Must have done then. Was there anything in it? What? Money. Did you pay him, mister? You owe us. You saw the show. You tore Charlie's costume. And you're standing on my mask. He looked down guiltily and saw that the golden mask was under his toe. Sorry. Then he said with awkward pity, You don't need a mask, my dear. You're a very pretty girl. Sure. Like the fairy on the top of a Christmas tree, after the cats got it. He saw that she didn't want his sympathy, only his money, and got out his wallet. She watched his finger hover over the £1 notes. It's for my face, she confided, sounding suddenly different. That's what we're doing this for, see? We're saving up so's I can have it fixed up proper, in Harley Street where all the knobs go. Charlie says I'm to have the best. Seeing his fingers had moved on to the fivers, she said in a tremble, Only it costs such a lot. Turning his back so his wife couldn't see what he was doing, he extracted 2 fivers from his wallet and dropped them into the waiting hand. What are you doing, Bill? Came his wife's suspicious voice from the car. Nothing, dear, said Mr. Barker, and saw the circus child smile. Charlie had already changed when Belle came through the hedge, and he was examining his costume ruefully. Let's see, she said. Is it torn bad? He put his fingers through a long slit. Can you mend it for me, Belle? Easy. It's only the seam, she said, and began to take off her sequin dress. Look in your hat, Charlie. He'd left his hat perched on a bush, and reaching for it, saw the money she'd put inside. £10, he said, not noticing she was crying. Belle, you're a marvel. How did you angle it? It was a soft touch, she said through her tears. Charlie didn't know what to do. Belle never cried, never. Not after the accident with the blood streaming down her cheek. Not in hospital with her face all wrapped up in bandages looking like the Invisible Man. Not once since he'd first met her. He'd been 5 years old then, and his parents had just been killed in a road accident. His Uncle Bert and Auntie Annie were going to look after him. It's not as if you're leaving circus life, they'd said. And there's our Belle, she'll be a sister for you. There she is on the Shetland. He thought he'd never seen anything so beautiful as she came riding out of the ring, smiling at him. You're Charlie, ain't ya? She said. You're my new brother. I'm going to marry you when I grow up, he told her, and everyone had laughed. You'll be lucky, she replied, but he'd known she'd been pleased. He looked at her now, all these years later, a thin girl in a faded dress weeping over her discarded finery, and his heart ached. Oh, stow it, Belle, he said. It isn't the end of the world. I don't want to leave. I don't want to go to no new school where they'll all stare at me. I want to stay with the circus. We'll finger something, he said, but he knew it was no good. Belle and Charlie walked slowly back to the circus and into the tent. After the bright sunlight, it was dark inside. They could see dimly the huge grey bulk of the 3 elephants, and Stella, the Shetland pony. No one here, said Belle. There was a rustling in the straw as the great creatures shifted their feet. The largest, recognizing Belle, stretched out her trunk in greeting. This was Tessie, an old animal with a ragged ear and a loving heart, whom Belle had known as long as she could remember. As she patted her side, a voice said, Ah, Belle, Charlie, I am pleased to find you. I wanted to have a word with you. It was Hugo Schneider, the star of the show. I hear your mum and dad are fixed up in America, Belle, he said. Well, sort of, said Belle. Uncle Bob said he'd try and find them something in his show, but it's not a proper billing. Lucky to find anything these days. Are you going with them? Auntie Annie says they'll have to see how it works out, Charlie explained. We're going to stay with our Auntie May and go to school regular. Mr. Schneider paused a moment. Then he said, First you, Charlie. I've been watching you. You've improved. In fact, you're not bad at all. So, for what it's worth, if you're looking for a holiday job at Christmas, it's yours. Come and see me at Mayer's. Charlie was speechless with joy and glanced quickly at Belle. Belle was smiling too, a pure, unselfish smile, which felt as if it was fastened to her face with nails. Good old Charlie, she said, with not a trace of envy to be heard. Run along now, Charlie, Mr. Schneider said. I want to speak to Belle alone. There was a moment's silence after Charlie left, and then Mr. Schneider sighed. Belle, I am sorry I have nothing good to say to you. When I first came here, I found you the vainest, most tiresome brat I'd ever met. But you had talent. What has happened to you? Oh, it's not your scar, he said, seeing her hand go up to the hair that concealed it. Your scar has done you a favor. You are not so proud. What is a scar in the circus? Grease paint, sequins stuck on it, and it is gone. You've lost your nerve, Belle, haven't you? No, I ain't. I just need time. Time? Too much time is bad. Fall down, get up again. That is the only way. How could I? I was in hospital. And when you came out of hospital, what then? Did you go up the ramp? No, you had too many excuses. Now come on, the ramp, please, for the last time. Belle took his hand and jumped onto one of the globes and set it moving with her feet. She steered towards the ramp and started up the first slope. Looking down at her feet, she saw the yellow stars whirling beneath her bare toes. Round and round, the stars were making her giddy. To think she'd once fooled about on the ramp, letting herself roll backwards deliberately towards Charlie coming up behind her, stopping just before the globes collided, making the audience gasp. She'd enjoyed it then. Must have been mad. How much further? The ball hit the side and wobbled beneath her feet. She was going to fall. Why were there so many Mr. Schneiders? "Charlie, help me!" she cried, and fell. Mr. Schneider caught her as she landed on him with a thud. "Smile," he said. "Hold up your arms and smile." But he didn't ask her to come to him for a job at Christmas. He knew she was finished. Until tomorrow, goodbye. Top was down. Only a discoloured circle showed where it had been. The painted buses, lorries and trailers had driven away in the heavy rain, leaving a weirdly patterned moonscape of mud. 5 cows now grazed where once the elephants had walked. Nothing was left of Peachem's world-famous circus except a sodden paper rose blooming improbably in a hedge. Belle and Charlie's world had ended. Charlie was glad it was over. Since it had to end, he wished it could have ended more quickly. It was horrid having to go to their winter quarters, arriving so unseasonably in the summer rain. So Charlie was surprised when Auntie Annie, Belle's mother, told him that she'd arranged for them to have a holiday on the farm, before they went off to stay with Auntie May, who was to look after them. Charlie watched her as she tried the effect of a silver sequin against the scarlet ones. "It was Belle who wanted it," Mrs. Marriott was saying. "Says you've never had a proper holiday. I didn't like to refuse her, poor kid, when she's feeling so low. What do you think, Charlie? Would you like it?" Charlie hesitated. The farm depressed him with all their friends gone. There was only Mr. Murphy left now, with Tessie the elephant, both looking greyer and more worried each day. Then Charlie thought of Belle and said loyally, "Yeah, that will be great." "Good boy," said Mrs. Marriott, relieved. "You know, Uncle Bert and I look on you as our son. And you will take care of Belle, won't you, Charlie?" "Yeah," he said. "I'll always take care of Belle." That night, Charlie dreamed he was back in the big top, smoothing footprints out of the sawdust with a rake. "Look at me!" called a voice high above him. "Charlie, look at me!" It was Belle, standing on the platform by the high wire, laughing down at him. Little fool, showing off again. "No, don't!" he shouted. "Come down, Belle! Don't be stupid!" They weren't allowed up there. 1,000 times they'd been told never, never touch the apparatus without permission. Never. It's as much as your life's worth. "I can do it," said Belle. "I can do anything." She began walking out into space. Charlie could see her feet in their soft shoes curving round the wire, her arms held out to balance her, the pale underside of her chin. "Come down, Belle! Come down at once!" And as if he had ill-wished her, she was falling. Down, down, down. Charlie sat up with a jerk, his mind full of blood and sawdust. Why did he always dream it that way? It hadn't ended like that. Belle wasn't dead. He lay awake staring into the dark, remembering Belle's arms thrashing the air as if she were trying to fly. Belle falling, twisting her body in mid-air and catching hold of the wire with her hands. swinging like a pendulum above his head while he watched in terror. He could hardly remember climbing the ladder, his face wet with tears. He had grasped the rail tightly and leaned out from the platform as far as he dared, stretching out his arm. She was too far away. "I can't reach her," he shouted desperately. "You'll have to come nearer." "I can't move." "Yes, you can," he screamed at her. "You're the one who can do anything. Now come on." She'd moved her bruised hands along the wire, one after the other, until she was near enough for him to grab her wrist. Even then he was afraid. His hands were wet and slippery with sweat. "I'm going to swing you towards me," he said. "Can you grab hold of something?" She had nodded. Oh, she'd been brave enough. Even when the edge of the platform caught her cheek, ripping it open, she'd bitten back her cry and managed to catch hold of a strut, taking the weight off Charlie's arm. Then, when they were safe back in the ring, she'd smiled and said faintly, "Why, Charlie, you're a hero. You saved my life." Mr. Murphy was in the shed talking to his elephant. "What are we going to do, Tessie, old girl? Got to think of something. Can't stay here forever. Mrs. Thorpe's got it in for you, lass. She don't like elephants no more, silly woman. Wants your shed to store turnips in or something. You and me's got to move on." "Ain't you found nothing yet, Mr. Murphy?" It was Belle coming silently into the shed. She moved like a shadow in her plimsolls. "We was just talking, Tessie and me, and we've decided to retire." "Retire?" "We got our plans fixed. A small zoo for Tessie with me in a cottage at the gate, so I can visit easy. Maybe earn the odd penny helping to muck out, and that way Tessie won't get lonely." He did not tell her that he'd already written to several zoos with no success, that no one wanted an old scarred circus elephant even as a gift. How could he say that often he'd woken up in the small dark hours, his heart on the trot, remembering his sister's words? "We've got to face it, Danny. You'll have to get that poor elephant put down." No, he couldn't tell Belle that there was no way he could support Tessie on his pension. Instead, he asked her to do him a favour. "I've offered to help Mr. Thorpe repair some fencing tomorrow. Might take a long time. I don't like to leave Tessie by herself all day. I wondered if you'd look after her for me. Tessie'll do anything for you, I've noticed. So I won't be fretting to come back early tomorrow." But he was back early. It was not yet 12 o'clock when they brought him back. Charlie and Belle were leading Tessie back from Bottom Meadow when they heard someone shouting. They looked round to see Mr. Thorpe and another man coming slowly and heavily across the grass, carrying between them a wattle hurdle, on which lay something still and dark. Mr. Thorpe shouted again, and now they could make out his words. "Run on ahead! Tell them to ring for an ambulance! Quick!" Charlie turned and ran. Belle could see now whom they were carrying on the hurdle. Mr. Murphy was lying on his back, his nose pointed to the sky, his eyes shut. "Is he?" Belle began. But Mr. Thorpe shouted over her words, "Get that wretched animal away!" For Tessie had followed her and was stretching out her trunk towards her old friend, as if puzzled by what was happening. "Back, Tessie, back," said Belle, trying to turn her. But the elephant had sensed something was wrong. Her small, pouched eyes were fixed with love on the unconscious man. "She won't do him no harm," Belle said. Belle stood between the elephant and the trestle. Mustn't let fear show. Fear was catching. For a moment she suddenly doubted her power over the great grey colossus who loomed over her. But then she thought, it was only Tessie, whom she'd known as long as she could remember. "Steady, old girl," she said. "Mustn't let Mr. Murphy think you've forgotten all he's taught you. That's better. Now, right turn. It'll be all right, you'll see. Mr. Murphy ain't going to die." "Mr. Murphy has had a mild stroke," said Mr. Thorpe at lunchtime. "But there's every hope that with rest he'll recover completely." "Grandpa had a stroke last year," said Johnny, the Thorpe's 6-year-old son. "And now he talks all funny. He goes, wah, wah, ow!" He finished shrilly as his mother kicked him. "Don't worry, Belle. He'll be all right, I'm sure. It's wonderful how quickly they get over it." "How long will Mr. Murphy be in hospital?" asked Charlie. "Oh, it's too early to tell," replied Mr. Thorpe. "I expect Mrs. O'Hara, his sister, will ring us as soon as she has any news," Mrs. Thorpe added. "She'll want to collect his things. He'll probably go straight to her house when he leaves hospital, as he'll need looking after." "What about Tessie?" Belle asked. The Thorpes exchanged a glance, but it was not quick enough. Belle might only have one eye uncovered, but that eye was sharp. They don't like Tessie, she thought. They want to get rid of her. Don't worry, Mr. Murphy's comfortable. Mr. Murphy's as well as can be expected. Everything's going to be all right. They were told this every day when they asked. But Belle was uneasy. I think we should go and see him ourselves, said Charlie, as they stood watching Tessie stuffing herself happily with hay. We could say we're relatives. Only I don't trust someone, she added, catching sight of Johnny, who was watching them. Who? The small boy asked. Never you mind, came the reply. The small boy tried not to cry and said, I was going to tell you something important, but I won't now. I'm sorry, Johnny, said Belle. We didn't mean to be beastly, only we're worried, see, and that makes people horrid. Johnny had a gift for eavesdropping. Being small, he was often hidden by a table or behind an armchair. If anyone could tell Belle what was going on, Johnny could. That woman's been and gone, he said. What woman? Mrs. O'Summit. You know, his sister. She took his things away. Mrs. O'Hara? When? She hasn't left already? Yes. But we wanted to see her. Why didn't you come and tell us she was here? I was listening, he said simply. Belle rushed past them into the farmhouse kitchen, which was empty. Johnny and Charlie followed her in. Where's your mum? Belle asked Johnny. Don't know. I see she had time for tea. They might have sent for us. They knew we'd be with Tessie. They said better not, Johnny explained. They said you'd only make a fuss about the elephant. What about her? The slaughterhouse people are coming for her on Monday. Won't she make a lot of cat's meat? When Charlie woke up, he was conscious of a shadow lying over the bright day like a bad dream. Tessie. Not all their pleading last night had been any good. On Monday, the slaughterhouse lorry was coming to take her away. It's murder, Belle shrieked. She can't do it. I won't let her. Tessie ain't hers. I'll go and tell Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy was very ill. Did she want to upset him? Did she want to spoil his recovery? Be reasonable, Belle, Mr. Thorpe had said. How can they keep an elephant in a council flat? Tessie's to go to the zoo. Mr. Murphy told me. It was then they learned that Mr. Murphy had already written to several zoos and been refused. Charlie found Belle in the elephant shed, her face alight with triumph. Barstow's, she said. The slaughterhouse. Barstow's of Somerton. I can look 'em up in the directory and cancel the arrangements. Listen, Charlie, I've got a plan. What plan? Promise to help me. Without knowing what I'm letting myself in for, come off it, Belle. Swear then, she demanded. I swear. It was a crazy plan. Kidnap Tessie and sneak her out of the farm through Yold Forest to Blandstock Safari Park, some 30 miles away. Blandstock's the first place Mr. Murphy would have tried, he objected. It's easy to say no by letter, but once she's in there, once we got her inside, oh, just trust me, Charlie. So he listened to her wild plan and watched her wave away any objections with a thin hand. We'll travel by night and hide up by day. You don't want poor Tessie to die, do you? Just give it a try, that's all I'm asking. I'll never ask you for nothing again, I promise. Please, Charlie. We'd need money, he said hesitantly. We got money. We got the fund. The fund, £107. But that was for your face, he said. That was for Harley Street. This is more important. He was suddenly angry, thinking of the hours they'd worked at their private shows so that Belle could have her pretty face again. And she could give it up just like that. Oh, it's easy to say so now, he said crossly. But what about our new school? They'll make you tie it back. How will you like that, then? If I tie it back, will you help me, Charlie? Yes, he said helplessly. Got a piece of string? He found an old shoelace and watched as she tied the long fair hair back from her face. Then she turned to him, her head tilted so that the light from the small high windows fell on her cheek. Penny for the peep show, she said bitterly. Charlie saw that her face still seemed cut in half, and that the left side of her mouth was pulled up a little so that she appeared to be smiling, though her eyes were miserable. It's not so bad, he said. Dunno what you've been making such a fuss about. Now, this plan of ours. Until tomorrow. Goodbye. Charlie had promised to help Belle kidnap Tessie, the elephant, to save her from being sent to the slaughterhouse. The first step was taken, and there was no going back. That afternoon, while Mr. Thorpe was out mending his fences, and Mrs. Thorpe was driving Johnny to a birthday party, Belle and Charlie went into the office to use the phone. The man at Barstow's didn't seem suspicious. "Mrs. Thorpe? Ah, yes. Good afternoon, madam. That's the elephant, isn't it? We have it down on our books for collection on Monday." "Oh. Oh, I see. You want to cancel it altogether." He was obviously disappointed, sounding like an executioner who'd been promised a queen only to have her snatched away at the last moment. Barstow's would never make history now. Belle's hand was trembling when she put down the phone. She and Charlie exchanged nervous smiles. Outside in the yard again, they sat on a bench and rehearsed their next act until they were word perfect. Belle's face felt naked with her hair tied back. Her hand kept going up to her left cheek, her fingers touching the scar briefly. "What's the matter? Does it itch?" Charlie asked. "No." "It wasn't so bad, was it, at lunch?" She didn't answer. He would never guess how she'd felt walking into the kitchen with her hair tied back, feeling all eyes on her face. "It's my scar they look at and then wish they hadn't. Nobody'll ever look me straight in the face no more." Except Johnny. Johnny was too young for tact. He had just stared. "Cor, what a big scar," he said, his voice expressing only interest, not pity. "I've got a scar on my knee, and I had to have 3 stitches. How many did you have?" 555, she said, exaggerating wildly. "Oh, did you get it?" he asked, almost enviously. "It was a tiger done it," she invented. "I was cleaning his cage out, see, and I slipped on the soap. Never fall down in front of tigers, Johnny, or they'll do you." "Ooh," he breathed in wonder. At least there was one admirer she hadn't lost. Then Charlie said suddenly, "She's back!" They ran to meet Mrs. Thorpe, putting on bright smiles like masks. Being circus children, they were practised performers. No one would have guessed they were lying. Their Auntie May had just rung up, they told Mrs. Thorpe, and she was going to take them on a canal holiday in a barge. Belle and Charlie were to meet the barge at Oxford on Monday. They were to catch the 2:35 from Somerton. "You know, you'd never get Tessie on that truck without us," said Belle. "She seems to have been acting sort of nervous lately," added Charlie. "Gone off the men here. I don't know why. Yesterday she was swinging her trunk like a sledgehammer when Mr. Thorpe went by. Reminded me of that time in Kent." "Shut up, Charlie. We're not supposed to talk about it. You know we promised." "What happened?" asked Mrs. Thorpe sharply. "Oh, nothing much. Just some man made a bit of a fuss. She didn't really hurt him," said Charlie. "He was only in hospital a week. But Mr. Murphy said she was as gentle as a lamb." "Oh, yes, she is with him," said Charlie. "And with me," said Belle. "But she doesn't like strangers, nor lorries. And you best keep Johnny away." Mrs. Thorpe looked so worried that they thought they'd better stop. "Yeah, I'll load her up for you. She won't be frightened with me. But I wish it was over and we was on that barge." On Monday morning at 10 to 11, an ill wind suddenly swept upon Goosebeak Farm. First Charlie came rushing in to say the cows were in the cornfield. Mr. Thorpe and his cowman went off at a run, and Charlie vanished again. Then Mrs. Thorpe, coming into her kitchen, found her big glass jug on the floor, with 100 glass splinters in a sea of milk. Before she had time to get a cloth, Johnny ran in, barefoot, to tell her that the goat had somehow got loose from its tether and was now in the garden, munching pansies. "Mrs. Thorpe! Mrs. Thorpe!" Charlie burst in through the door again in high excitement. "Barstow's have come for Tessie!" "Mind the milk!" she shrieked at him. Charlie skidded to a halt, knocking over a chair. "That's dangerous," he said reproachfully. "I'm quite aware of that," came the reply. "Tell the driver I'll be out in a minute." "Oh, he can't wait. He's in a hurry. He wouldn't even come down the lane. He's parked on the main road. You can see it. Look. Belle's taking Tessie down now. I'll keep Johnny in if I were you, Mrs. Thorpe. Tessie's playing up a bit." "But I want to watch, said Johnny. "You stay where you are, do you hear? I just come to say goodbye and thanks for everything. I can't stop. The driver says he'll give us a lift to Somerton if we hurry." "But Charlie, your train's not till... Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, the goat's eaten your roses." "Not my golden glory." "Don't know what they're called. Yellow ones. I must rush. Goodbye, Mrs. Thorpe. Bye, Johnny." Charlie, wait a minute." But he was gone. Mrs. Thorpe stood with too many things to do, her mind filled with goats and roses and broken vases, and her little boy whining that Belle had not said goodbye to him. She felt uneasy, with an odd sense of having been blown off course. But they were circus children, she comforted herself. Brought up rough, they'll be all right. It seemed ages since Belle had stopped the lorry. Why didn't Charlie come? She had flagged the driver down and burst into sobs when he stopped, so that he'd spent a long time comforting her. Eventually, she had managed to say that her friend was hurt, needing help, and was in the field across the road. Look, there's Tessie there, Belle cried loudly. Where? I can see no one, said the lorry driver. Over there in that field. Do you see her now? She's limping. She's hurt. Behind the lorry driver's back, unnoticed, a boy led a huge grey shape, a vast wrinkled shadow that moved with swaying grace into the wood. Its enormous feet made no sound on the tarmac. And then the fat lump had to tread on a dead stick. There was a crack like a pistol shot, and the driver swung round. He stared. Then he grabbed Belle by the arm and marched her across the road. There is an elephant in that wood, he said. Oh, sure, she said, and I've got a tiger in my pocket. You are not fooling me, he said, smiling happily. It is a cow elephant from India or Ceylon, perhaps. We had elephants at home when I was a small boy. Come, we will go to her, and you will tell me what naughty things you are up to, please. To the driver's absolute amazement, the girl suddenly did 3 high-leaping somersaults, one after the other, held her skinny arms up in the air and smiled at him brilliantly. Tara boom, she said. Meet Christabel of Cosmo and Christabel, the star spinners. Come and see tremendous Tessie, the largest and most lovable elephant in the world. All at Peachem Circus next week. Best move your truck, Mr. Carr wants to pass. Charlie, standing behind a tree, heard Belle doing her circus spiel. She was trying to charm the driver, he thought, as she had once charmed audiences in the days when she had a pretty face and all the impudence in the world. Then the voices were drowned out as the lorry driver drove off. The man must have gone. Tessie, mistaking the leaves that tickled her rump for flies, broke a branch off the nearest tree and began swatting her flanks noisily. Charlie, stop her, you fool! The whole wood's twitching like it's got fleas. You stop her if you think it's so easy, he said furiously. There was no need. Tessie, on hearing Belle's voice, had dropped the branch and was trying to look innocent. You've just got to be firm. It ain't difficult. Belle sounded smug. It infuriated Charlie. Think yourself clever, don't you, he thought. But it's me Mr. Schneider chose, not you, and now you're going to muck it up for me. He didn't say these words, but they remained in his mind like poison. Charlie noticed that Belle's hair was loose on her shoulders again, with a few strands falling across her scarred cheek. She was cheating already. Belle saw the glance and said, The shoelace must have fallen off. Then she added in a subdued voice, Well, we'd better get on, hadn't we? They had 2 fields to cross before they reached the derelict barn where they'd planned to shelter until it was dark. They managed to get there undetected. Their luggage was still where they had left it, and so was the food. Belle tethered Tessie, then sat down on some straw and unpacked the sandwiches. We've done it, Charlie, she whispered. There was a short silence while Charlie picked at a sandwich. I'm sorry, it's the heat. They've gone off a bit. And there's biscuits and cake. Another silence. How did things go at the farm? She asked at last. Charlie was in fact rather proud of the way he'd managed. The goat had been a splendid touch, good timing and good luck. That's what Mr. Schneider always said an artiste needed. At the thought of Mr. Schneider, he lost any desire to boast. Oh, all right, he said, knowing he was behaving badly. Why are you so cross? What's the matter? Belle asked. Nothing. I hate people who say nothing when they've got prickles sticking out a mile. Did you think I didn't notice? Why are you being like this? Are you afraid of being caught? They won't send us to prison, not kids of our age. We've got nothing to lose. That did it. You haven't got anything to lose. You don't think of anyone else, do you? You don't care if I lose my chance. He broke off, furious with himself and with her. Anyway, I don't want to talk about it any more. Did you pack the alarm clock? Yes. Best set it for 11. Let's get some sleep now. When Charlie woke up, it was dark in the barn, but he knew at once that he was alone. By the light of his torch, he could see his holdall with a note pinned to it. The note read, Dear Charlie, I am sorry. I never thought. I'm a pig. Tell them it was all me and that you knew nothing about it and been looking for me. That way you won't get into trouble. Love, Belle. P.S. Please don't tell them where I'm going. Charlie ran out of the barn and across the wood. Belle! Belle! He cried. There was no answer. He ran along the verge of Somerton Road, not glancing at the tall fir trees on the other side of the road. Belle, hiding with Tessie, heard him go by. It was midnight now. Belle stood by the edge of the road, watching the few late cars passing, yellow-eyed as tigers in the night. It was time to leave. She'd never before been alone. Still, it had to be done. Charlie had saved her life. She could hardly repay him by spoiling his. Good luck. See you sometime, she thought. The old circus adieu. Oddly enough, it helped her now. Forward, Tess, she said. Forward, old girl. They crossed the road and started on their long journey. It was 7 miles to Yould Forest by road. How many by field and footpath? 4 o'clock in the morning, Charlie got to his feet, yawning and stretching. Something must have woken me, he thought. Where was Belle now? He couldn't rid himself of the feeling that somewhere she too was lost and frightened. It was impossible that she could have got there before him. A truck had given him a lift almost immediately, and he'd been waiting for hours. He went on staring at the empty road, jerking his eyelids every time he felt them falling. Now he seemed to see a grotesque shadow swaying silently up the grass verge. He'd been deceived before, although this was the right shape. There was no one beside this shadow. The shadow kept advancing, getting larger and more oddly shaped by the moment. Charlie! It was Belle, not so much riding the elephant as glued to it. Where have you been? He demanded. I've been waiting here all night. I thought I might find you here, waiting, hogging my big act. Charlie opened the gate to the bridle path and let them through. I'm so tired, said Belle. Let's stay here, said Charlie. It seems safe enough. You go to bed, I'll see to Tessie. I must tether her, she said sleepily. I'll manage. Belle was too tired to argue. She struggled against sleep. Wasn't there something she should have done? Told Charlie. What was it? The rope. Use the rope. It was no good. Her eyes closed again. On the other side of the clearing, the elephant shifted her feet and felt the jerk of the tether on her hind leg. Backing a little, she pulled at the chain with her trunk. The stake to which it was attached slid gently out of the soft ground. Until tomorrow, goodbye. Belle and Charlie had begun their journey across Yould Forest to Blanstock Safari Park, where they hoped to find a new home for Tessie the elephant. The journey had been exhausting. Belle had fallen asleep, and Charlie had been left to tether the elephant before he himself could get some rest. And now there was someone shouting his name, when he'd only just fallen asleep, or so it seemed. "Wake up, Charlie! Wake up! Tessie's gone!" Belle started running backwards and forwards in the clearing, calling, "Tess! Tess!" her voice as high as a bird's. There was confusion everywhere. Wisps of hay decorated the bushes like bleached tinsel. "What happened?" Charlie asked. "She gone crazy?" "No, of course not. She just likes unpacking, and she's been at the food. I ain't got no table manners." Belle's smile was shaky, but at least she'd attempted a joke, hadn't shouted at him, though it was his fault. He had tethered Tessie. Now Belle was parting the branches here and there, calling out Tessie's name, trying to see through the leaves. Charlie scrambled to his feet, tripped over a hairbrush, and trod on the recorder Uncle Bert had given him for Christmas. Automatically, he picked it up. It was undamaged. "I don't know where to start looking," Belle said helplessly, and turned. She caught sight of the recorder in his hands. "Oh, that's right. Don't worry about Tessie. Just stand there and play us a tune." She broke off and then said, "Oh, Charlie, you're clever. That'll fetch her." Charlie looked at her, pleased but bewildered by her sudden admiration, not liking to admit he had no idea what caused it. "Go on," she said. "Don't say you've forgotten how it goes." "What goes?" "Oh, of course." He put the recorder to his lips. Loud as he could, he began to play the music for the entrance of the elephants. There was a rustling of leaves coming nearer, getting louder, and the bushes parted. But it was a man who walked into the clearing. He was tall and thin and somewhat untidy. He smiled into their disappointed faces and said, "Hello, I thought you were Pan." "No," said Charlie. "Sorry." "We ain't seen no one round here," said Belle. "Have we, Charlie?" "No." "Pan," the man repeated. "You know, the merry, merry pipes of Pan." He smiled back at them so amiably that Charlie found himself apologizing. "Sorry, it was only me playing me recorder." The man laughed. Behind his back, making surprisingly little noise, the elephant loomed out of the bushes. She seemed puzzled by so unusual a circus ring and so small an audience. The man hadn't heard her come, had no idea she was standing behind him. She was about to take a step towards him. "Stop!" shouted Belle. The elephant stopped. It was uncanny. "I'm sorry. It was rude of me to laugh," said the man. "Why should you have heard of Pan?" "Sit down!" Belle cried. Tessie sat down obediently. The man looked surprised, then came forward and sat down on a log. Belle stepped quickly over to where Tessie stood, saying, "I've got to be excused. Don't turn round and watch." "I assure you," the man said, "I had no idea of embarrassing your sister." "Cousin," said Charlie. "She's shy, hates being looked at." "Is it her scar?" "Oh, her scar's all right. I don't mind it. The thing is," Charlie continued impulsively because the man looked so concerned, "she's lost her head for rights." "You know," the man said, "it might be worth asking a doctor. I believe there's some sort of therapy that might work. I saw a program on television. Actually, it was about people who are afraid of flying." In his mind, Charlie saw not aeroplanes, but the big top, with the high flyers somersaulting way above the safety net. "Please, mister, can you tell me about it? I'll come with you part the way." Belle sat on the grassy bank, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was over 2 hours since Charlie had gone off with the man. She was growing more hungry and more anxious every minute. "Silly fool's got lost," she muttered. Now Belle thought she could hear voices. Best leave Tessie and investigate. She got up and parted the branches and wriggled through. A figure rose out of the leaves and grabbed hold of her, crooking an elbow round her neck. "Hey, I've got another one," it said. She couldn't see who was holding her. When she kicked, the arm tightened round her neck so she couldn't scream. She was dragged back into the clearing, where more figures stepped out of the trees. There were 4 of them, their faces painted with mud. At first she thought they were soldiers. Then she noticed they were wearing faded denims below their patched khaki shirts, and one was a boy no bigger than she was. The tallest figure, who appeared to be their leader, looked her over menacingly, then called out, "Bring in the prisoner." 2 more figures appeared, holding between them the struggling Charlie. His face was patched with red, his lips split and bleeding, his shirt torn. "Let go of her or I'll kill you," he shouted. "You keep quiet if you don't want your bird hurt," said the leader, eyeing Belle. "Been done already by the looks of it. How'd you get that, eh?" She couldn't speak. She could hardly breathe. "Let go of her neck, Jerry. You're going to strangle her. She won't scream, will you, chick?" The arm round her neck was taken away, and she was pushed over towards Flick. "What do you want?" she croaked painfully. "Who are you?" She could see now that they were not men, but youths, the oldest no more than 16 or 17. "We're outlaws," said the leader. "Robin Hood and his merry men, robbing the rich and giving to the poor. The rich, that's you. The poor, that's us." "I ain't got no money." "That's what he said, and he were a dirty little liar. £35 he had on him. Not a bad haul." "I couldn't help it, Belle," cried Charlie, close to tears. "Turn your pockets out. Bella, is it?" the youth said. "Come on, hand it over like a good girl or we'll have to search you." "Leave her alone," shouted Charlie helplessly. But Belle had heard what none of them seemed to have noticed, a great heaving and rustling in the ferns behind her. "Don't move," she said. Even as she spoke, she saw the leader's jaw drop, as if a hinge had broken. His light eyes, fixed in terror, stared over her shoulder. "She'll attack you if you move." Belle said fiercely. "She'll mash you into the mud, so keep still." She looked at Charlie, trying not to laugh. To her astonishment, he too was staring past her, his eyes wide and frightened. Puzzled, she turned round. The elephant no longer looked the gentle animal they had known. She was swaying backwards and forwards, her furious eyes fixed on the youth who'd been holding Belle. The elephant smelled fear. With her trunk aloft, she gave the trumpet scream of battle. But Belle was now walking towards her, saying, "Stand, Tess, stand. Gently, my fat darling, it's all right." It was odd that after such a strange beginning they should become friends. Well, friends of a sort. It began when the boy had started coughing, a dry, rapid cough that shook his shoulders and made him gasp for breath. "Pat him on the back, can't you?" Charlie said, thinking he was choking. Then he saw the leader slip his hand into his pocket. "Hey, stop that," he said sharply. "Don't worry, kid, it ain't a gun. They're fruit drops for Billy. He don't like cough sweets. He's got a bit of a cold." He handed the boy a sweet. Then he held up the bag out to Charlie. "Thanks," said Charlie. It was as if he'd accepted an olive branch. Immediately the outlaw relaxed. "You put up a good fight," the leader said admiringly. "Have to hand it to you. Proper little scrapper you are." "He may be featherweight, but he ain't chicken," said the black youth. "You can say that again, Pete. He sure ain't chicken." "What's your name, kid?" said the leader. "Charlie." "I'm Flick, and Billy here's me kid brother. Them's Joe, Bert, Dave, Jerry, Pete." Charlie was so tired that he made no attempt to distinguish between the faces. But still, here they were, he and Belle sitting beside the outlaw's hideout, having got their possessions back, drinking hot tea from enamel mugs, listening to their stories. First Flick told how he and his younger brother Billy had been in various homes. "One day I left a note saying I was off to London, then me and Billy came to the forest." "You got to throw him off the scent," said the black youth, whose name was Pete. "So when we was ready to leave, I found the biggest blabbermouth and told him we was off to the smoke. Anyhow, then we came here. They'll never guess in a million years where we are. They think we're too soft to live wild, but we ain't. We manage." "You can't stay here forever, though," Belle said. "What happens in winter?" It was as though she'd said a dirty word. There was a shocked silence while they glared at her. "We'll manage somehow," said Flick curtly. Nevertheless, they liked Belle. Since she'd walked fearlessly up to the elephant, they'd treated her with respect. Belle glowed under their open admiration, laughing and tossing back her hair, no longer ashamed of the scar that seemed in this company like a badge of honour. "How did you come by the elephant, miss?" Billy had asked. To Charlie's surprise, Belle had told the truth, leaving out only names and where they'd planned to end up. The outlaws' faces softened as they listened. Only Jerry had scowled and said he preferred tins of cat meat to that monster any day. "Tessie's not dangerous. She's as gentle as a lamb, unless she's provoked." "Some lamb," Flick said, smiling at her. "Honest, she's an old softy. Come and stroke her." Flick was taken aback, like a boy confronted with a dare he wanted to refuse but couldn't. "Go on, Flick," sneered Jerry. "You ain't scared, not Flick the knife." So Flick got to his feet and said, "Yeah, why not?" He and Belle walked slowly up to the elephant. The watchers held their breaths as Flick reached up and touched the elephant's forehead. Then he laughed with relief and said, "Come on, you beggars, pay your respects to the old lady." They went up one by one, slowly, nervously, to touch the elephant and move on. The last one was Jerry. Charlie heard Belle say, "No, not you. Keep away." "What do you mean? Why not me?" "She hates you. You attacked me. She'll never forget or forgive." Somehow the outlaws had taken charge of them. "You never managed without us," they said. "Let's have a look at your map." So they'd trusted them. Belle and Charlie kept close to Tessie as they lumbered through the forest at night. At last they reached the enclosure where Flick said they should spend the rest of the night. Belle was reluctant to be fenced in, but Flick had brushed aside her concern. "It's a smashing place to hide. Bracken higher than your head and branches down to your knees. And the people stick to the paths." Eventually they settled for the night. Tessie's rope was tethered a long way from the outlaws, who were afraid of being trampled in their sleep. But in the morning Tessie had got free again. She was standing over the saddlebags, her tether trailing behind her, eating the last of the carrots. "You ain't fit to look after her. Can't you even tie a knot proper?" Flick asked. "I did," Belle protested. "I checked it twice. We tied her to a tree, look." She indicated the tree, round whose trunk part of the tether was knotted. "It must have broke." "It's been cut," said Charlie. "Who'd have done that?" "Jerry," the others cried. "And he's gone too." "He was never really one of us," said Billy. Belle got the impression that none of them really liked him. "But he wouldn't go to the police about Tessie, would he?" she asked. "Not him," said Flick. "He's on the run." Jerry did not go to the police. Jerry was walking moodily down the high street when a shop window caught his attention. Behind the glass there were newspaper cuttings fastened to a board and several glossy photographs. Jerry stared at them, hating them all. The sign above the pictures caught his eye. Laboriously he spelt out the words, "Rhindhurst Daily Advertiser." Then he opened the door and went in. "How much will you give me for a scoop?" "Until tomorrow. Goodbye." The young reporter didn't care for Jerry. Nobody ever had. That was his trouble. There was something very off-putting about his large, clumsy figure and his podgy cheeks. Yet, oddly enough, it was the spite in his small, dark eyes that made the young man take any notice of his story. "You expect me to believe that?" the reporter asked, half believing it. "It's true. I can show you where they're hiding." "You're seriously telling me that an elephant was kidnapped 2 days ago and nobody noticed?" "They dunno it's gone, see? The farm people think it's at the slaughterhouse, and the slaughterhouse think it's at the farm, I told you." "What's the farmer's name?" "Dunno, they wouldn't say. These circus children, Belle and Charlie, wasn't it? What was their surname?" "Dunno, they wouldn't say." "Name of the circus?" "Dunno, they wouldn't say." They don't seem to have trusted you with much, do they? What about the parents? Didn't they report the children missing?" "They've gone off to America." "Just went off without making any arrangements for their children?" Jerry looked at him blankly, seeing nothing unusual in that. In his world, children were often abandoned. The young reporter hesitated. It seemed a fantastic story. But he looked back at Jerry and decided it was true. That sullen face did not belong to a practical joker. Charlie and Pete, one of the outlaws, were on lookout duty. They lay hidden in the tall bracken, talking idly in whispers. Charlie told Pete about life in the circus. Pete told him about the forest. "Funny, ain't it?" he said. "I was brought up in the town, never thought much about the country before. But living here, it's different somehow. It gets you." It was warm and pleasant in the drowsy sunlight. Charlie forgot they were supposed to be on lookout and lay back, gazing up at the sky. But Pete had been well trained. His restless eyes saw the distant figures as soon as they came into view. "Flick! Flick! Jerry's fetched the law! They'll be here in a minute!" There was an orderly confusion. The outlaws scurried about like ants, grabbing up their possessions. Bert picked up the saddlebags, half empty now, and slung them over his shoulder. "Follow us," Flick whispered. They ran through the trees, leaping over fallen logs and arching roots. Tessie, with Belle running beside her, kept up with them easily. When they'd run for about 5 minutes, Flick stopped them, and they stood, poised, listening. They could hear voices faintly in the distance. "That's them," Flick whispered. "Get her in there, Belle. Pete, you take Joe and lay a false trail. Quick now. Meet up in Shortlands, the Dead Pine, okay?" Flick jumped down into the stream and beckoned the others to follow. They hurried on, with Tessie splashing contentedly along until they could go no further. To Charlie's surprise, the stream seemed to run straight into a short brick wall with wire fences on either side. Then he saw it was a bridge, the shallow arch barely clearing the water. On the other side of the fences there was a wide grass verge, a narrow road, and then the forest began again. Flick stared at the elephant, looking for the first time at a loss. "What on earth are we going to do with her?" he muttered. "She can push the fence down easy," said Charlie. "Yeah, Get us all caught, that would. Nothing bugs the foresters worse than broken fences. He stood, frowning. Then he said regretfully, "Have to dump you. Sorry. Once they get you, they won't look no further. Come on, lads." Bert still had the saddlebag over his shoulder. "That's ours," Charlie protested. "Was yours, you mean?" said Bert, making as if to go. "Flick!" Belle cried. "Flick, please!" Belle was standing by the fence, looking small and fragile beside the huge creature. "Oh, let 'em have it, Bert." Half sad, half envious, he said, "Bye, Circus. Be nice meeting you." Belle and Charlie were deserted, left out like titbits on a plate for the police to gobble up, while Flick and his gang made their escape. "Get Tessie to smash down a fence," Charlie said furiously. "I hope they all get caught. Rot 'em. Come on, Tessie, trample it down." "We'd be the ones to get caught," said Belle. "You be lookout and I'll get her over." Lookout, thought Charlie angrily, as he climbed the fence and ran towards the road. Then he stopped, hearing Belle's voice behind him. "Hup, hup, hup," she was saying, and he turned in time to see the elephant rear up on her hind legs, as she'd been trained to do in the ring. But it was Belle, not Mr. Murphy, who was persuading her across the low fence. And it was bumpy, slippery grass, not sawdust, beneath her feet. Like a tottering mountain she wobbled. Her enormous forelegs were like great rocks poised above Belle's head. Belle's too near, Charlie thought. She hasn't allowed herself enough room. But he didn't move. Long training kept him from disturbing a performer's concentration. "Down!" Belle shouted. It was as if a mountain toppled. Then the elephant was straddling the fence, her front legs on one side, her back legs on the other. All were safely planted on the grass, nowhere near Belle. She'd not even had to jump out of the way. Charlie let out his breath, only to hear the sound of a car coming. Too late. But it swept past with the driver not even turning his head. "Sorry," said Charlie guiltily. "I didn't hear it in time. I was watching you." Couldn't have had a better excuse. "Good, wasn't I?" said Belle. "Mr. Murphy couldn't have done it better. Now, we've got to get her hind legs over. Come and hold her head a minute. We'll have to chance the cars." So Charlie held Tess's head, while Belle, tapping each leg in turn, guided the huge feet as they lifted over the dipping wire. Then they quickly pushed the posts upright and fluffed up the crushed bracken with their hands. Didn't look too bad. Charlie ran down to the road. It was empty. About 100 yards away he saw a gateway into the forest at the other side. "Quick, follow me!" he shouted and ran towards it, hearing Belle and Tessie behind him. There was a notice on the gate saying, "Shortlands Enclosure," in large letters. Charlie didn't stop to read the small print, but ushered Belle and Tessie through. When they were in, he closed the gate behind them and raked over the leaves on the ground with a stick before following. Flick would have been proud of him, he thought ironically. The editor of the Rhindhurst Daily Advertiser looked at his young reporter. It's a great story. I love it. Kidnapped elephant in Yold Forest. Couldn't let Jumbo die, say circus children. But I'll be a lot happier if you got some photographs of this elephant. I need a few hard facts." "I could find out what circuses have gone bankrupt this year," the young man said eagerly. "That's what comes of not taking on a local lad. Peachem Circus. They closed down in July. Phone Mrs. Thorpe of Goosebeak Farm. That's where the circus's winter quarters are. She'll know about it. Now, which way did you say they were headed?" "Over Black Ridge." Then it must be Blandstock Safari Park. Probably planning to go down on their knees and beg the Duke to save their elephant. Here, let me arrange a reception committee for them. It was already dark and wet. Belle and Charlie had done what they could for Tessie. At 7, when the rain had started, they'd spread one of their ground sheets on her back, where it looked like a pocket handkerchief. At 10, they could bear the leaking forest no longer, and decided to move. Because they didn't know exactly where they were, they came out of the trees a good mile from the track Belle had pointed out on the map. They were riding Tessie now, as they were both tired and their feet were soaked. Belle kept drifting off to sleep, and jerking awake when she gradually became aware that Tessie was walking strangely, unevenly, and there was an odd sucking, splashing sound. "It's a bog!" she screamed. "Charlie! Tessie's gone into a bog!" "What shall we do?" he replied. "Turn her back?" "No, I'll walk in front. Then if I start sinking, Tessie can pull me up, and I'll try another way." "No, Charlie, I don't want you to." "Well, we can't stay here." So Charlie walked ahead, stepping from hassock to hassock and testing the depths in between with his foot. Once he slipped and went up to his knee in water, and Belle cried out as she saw him disappear. But eventually the ground grew firmer. It was the only bog they came across. They found somewhere to settle for the rest of the night, and sank into a deep, exhausted sleep. At 7 the next morning, they came up from behind a hedge 1/4 mile from Blandstock. Charlie ran ahead and waved a truck down. "An elephant's got loose from the safari park. We're trying to drive her back. Quick, go and tell him to open up." The driver gave him a stunned look, turned his truck round and drove off towards the gates. So far, so good. They wanted the gatekeeper flustered, half asleep and only too glad to fling his gates open. They raced down the road, only slowing when they reached the corner. Now at last they saw the great gateway to Blandstock Safari Park before them. The truck was parked on the verge, and just past it there were other cars. The driver was talking excitedly to a group of men who were looking at the children as they herded the elephant down the last stretch of road. Belle could hardly stop herself leaping for joy as she realized they'd done it. The gates were opening. Then the whole world seemed to explode. Bright lights flashed. People crowded round, men with cameras. Policemen. "No!" she shouted, and flung her arms round Tessie's trunk. "Oh, Tessie, we did our best," she wept. She felt Charlie's arm around her shoulder. He was crying too. It was this photograph that was to dog them for the rest of their lives, pinned to the notice board of their new school, turning up years later in old magazines, lining the drawers of a boarding house in Bognor, and framed on a wall of a cafe in Brighton. There they were, caught forever, crying like babies. There even seemed, by some trick of the light, to be a tear shining in Tessie's round eye. The effect had been tremendous, just as the editor of the Rhindhurst Advertiser thought it would. Everyone wanted Tessie. Belle and Charlie's story went straight to the people's hearts. A Save Tessie fund was started. 3 circuses suddenly offered to take her, and so did the Duke of Blandstock. So, with Mr. Murphy's blessing, that was where she stayed. Belle and Charlie liked their new school, maybe because the school liked them. Belle worked hard, having got it into her head that she'd like to be a zoologist or a vet. "I'm good with animals," she said, with her old incurable boastfulness. "The Duke says I'm amazing." Charlie was disconcerted. "Aren't you going to go back to the circus?" he asked. "Dunno." "Belle, you must. Mr. Schneider said we could both have a job at Christmas, not only me, you too." "Big of him," she said grandly. "The Duke said I could come up and help at the safari park in the holidays. They like me there. The keepers say I'm a wonder." "Oh, Belle," he said, laughing. "It's true. You've got to stay in the circus, or I won't marry you when I grow up." And she tossed her head, smiling, and just as she had done so long ago, said, "You'll be lucky. Goodbye." In the late autumn, 2 masked figures are dancing on the grass like sequined dragonflies. The clown is in love with the ballerina. He blows her a kiss. She doesn't see him, but pirouettes as if in a dream. Now the clown holds up his hand and a rose blossoms from his fingers. He offers it to the ballerina, who takes it, then dances on. Faster and faster she goes, to sink at last into a deep curtsy. The clown bows.